Greetings, Meteran. Today we're going to be patterning a Gomlek based on the pattern handout and using the measurements as explained in the handout. So just showing you how to translate that into a workable pattern. I'm going to be doing that on graph paper today because this can be translated to trugrid, but it is hard to get the size of this garment on my cutting table for you to be able to see it clearly on trugrid. So I'm just going to show you the whole process here, and I would be doing the same thing at full scale on trugrid. Trugrid is an interfacing material that comes with a 1-inch grid already printed on it. So it's great for creating patterns. You could even sew it together and try it on as a mock-up if you chose to. You also could use pattern paper that has a grid on it, or some wrapping paper sometimes comes with a 1-inch grid printed on the back. So it's another great trick for making up patterns. You can also use those if you're scaling a pattern from a small grid, maybe that's printed in a book, and scaling that up. But today I'm going to show you how I customize this pattern and draw it out on the trugrid or on my pattern paper. You always start with writing the name of the pattern. So I have on here that this is a Gomlek pattern, and you put the name of your person and the date that you made the pattern. I also want to determine the scale. And just as an estimate to make sure this fit on the screen, I was checking the scale here. This is a 1/4-inch grid, but I'm going to treat each of these squares as a 4-inch square. And that's just for the purposes of making sure that this all fits on this page and that you can see it clearly in the video. But I'm going to notate that up here that I'm using a 4-inch grid, 4:1, so that I know what my scale is. So let's start with creating the measurements that are needed here in the measure table. So the first is A. That's going to be the length of the garment. So that is top of shoulder to the ankle or the floor. You could also translate this as preferred garment length. So for the cases of the person I'm making this for, the preferred garment length is 56 inches. But you see we have plus 1 inch. So I'm going to make that 57 inches. The chest or bust is 43, and I have plus 4 to 6 inches. I would do 4 inches for the Gomlek because that's the underlayer, and then you might even go 5 for your under caftan and 6 for your over caftan. That just guarantees that your layers all fit together nicely. That additional inches is actually giving us the ease. And you'll notice that it's still divided by 2 because we're only drawing one side. We're going to draw either the front or the back. So we're dividing the chest or bust measurement after we add the ease in. So the bust here is 43 inches. And for the Gomlek, I'm going to just add 4. So I'm going to make that 47 and then divide by 2. That would be 23.5. The point of the shoulder to the wrist. So I'm just going to check where I had that measurement. So here it's going to be 26 inches plus 1 inch. So 27. And that's giving us the seam allowance and finishing allowance, adding that inch in there. Otherwise, that point of shoulder to wrist, I also like to measure that around a bent elbow so that you ensure that when you bend your arm, your sleeve doesn't go hiking up. You want to make sure that you're accommodating the movement of your arm as well. The largest bicep measure. Okay, so here I had 16.75. I'm going to make that 17, and we're adding 2 inches. So I'm making that 19 inches. So if you are close to the measurement, you can just round that one. It's just going to make the sleeve have a tad more ease to it, which is just fine. If a taper, okay, so the sleeve here on the Gomlek can either be cut as a straight line or it can be tapered. And if you're tapering it, you'll see we need measurement E. And E is, if we're tapering it, the largest hand measurement. And I like to do that with what I call a duck hand. So you make a duck face with your hand and you measure around this, and that ensures that you're going to be able to get your hand through the hand opening of the sleeve. All of these same tricks could be used for any garment that you're drafting, just to ensure that you're making sure that it fits your body. So here the duck hand is 10 inches, so I'm going to make this 11. The armpit to floor, okay, or waist or hip down. So you see this addition of that other measurement, that's for when we make the salwar pattern, which we'll do in a separate video. But for now I'm doing armpit to floor because what I want is this side body measurement that's actually going to come out here on my inset gores. So I'm checking for that measurement. Okay, and here I'm just going to the ankle, but I have that as 52 plus 1, so that will be 53 inches. The underarm gusset, I'm just going to go with a 3-inch by 3-inch square. I find that's a good size for standard sizes, or go up to a 5 by 5-inch square if you're a plus size. So here actually I'm going to do a 4-inch. I kind of have an in-between size, but somebody who I know wants to have excellent range of motion with their arms, so I want to guarantee that she'll have that. Okay, and then H was this measurement for the bottom of the gusset, and you'll see that I say swing out to available fabric. So what I like to do is cut these main body pieces first, and then take up what is left in that additional space. So I'm going to make that as wide as it can be. I could choose to cut my pattern. Sometimes I might cut out a pattern piece, optimizing what's on the pattern material, and then note on there that it could swing wider. So it just gives you a little extra room. The out seam, we want to measure from our waist going over our bottom. So it's nice to bend forward and touch your toes and measure from your waist over your bum all the way down to your ankle. And that gives us a nice outseam measurement. So here I have an outseam of 41 plus 2 inches. So I'm going to make that 43. The largest point at the hip or waist. And the reason I say hip or waist is that some people might have a waist that's larger than the hip or vice versa. Here the hip is larger, so that's at 54. And then I'm going to add 4 inches, making that 58, and then divide by 2. So that will be 29. The inseam is the crotch to ankle measurement. And that's an easy way to measure that is to hold a ruler in the crotch at crotch level, parallel to the floor, and then measure from that ruler down to the floor. Just an easier way to get that measurement. So here I have 28.5. I'm going to round that to 29 and then add my 2 inches. This is partly for seam allowance and partly for a little bit of ease. So I feel like it's okay to round up there. And then rise. This is from the waist front to the waist back. So this is going through the center of the crotch and giving you that rise so that we ensure that we don't have pants that are pulling as we sit down. So here I have 34. So I'm going to add my 4 inches, that'll be 38, and then divide by 2, that will be 15, 19. And then the ankle is the largest point around the heel. And again, that's like if you point your foot and you want to measure around the heel of your foot around the ankle to ensure that you can get your foot through the leg hole when we make our pants. So I'm going to take that amount, 12.25, add the 2 inches. In this case, I'm going to make it 12.5. Add my 2 inches, make that 14.5, and then divide by 2. And I'm going to round up here too. I'm going to make that 7.5 instead of 7.25. So again, I'm making some judgment calls where I'm deciding to round on this based on what that corresponds to in the garment itself. So some places, especially with the pants, we really would like to have a little more ease, and that's not going to hurt at all. Again, we have a fitted ankle. We even see some Turkish salwar having little buttons at the ankle to tighten up the ankle. So you could make it big enough to go over your foot and then have a pair of buttons that will tighten that up at the ankle. What we do not see in 16th century Turkish salwar or pants is we do not see big puffy pants. So those big puffy ones that you might have seen before, we don't see those in 16th century Turkish. So we're going back to the Gomlek and going to start drawing out our pattern. So as I said, I'm converting this to a 4-inch grid. Okay, just to help with this process, I've gone ahead and divided all of my numbers that are in my normal chart that would go directly inch for inch on trugrid. I've divided them all by 4 because I'm scaling this down to fit on the page for you. So we'll go ahead and start creating our pattern using the letters in the correct positions onto the paper. And this is even being done by somebody who swears I can't draw. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so we want to find roughly center, and then I'm doing a width B of 6 squares. So I'm going to start with that kind of just roughed out. And the length A of 14.25. So just for the heck of it, I'm going to start up here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14.25. And then go the same direction. I'm going to say there's my 2.5. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. Okay, so that's giving me my top and bottom. I'm going to put this center line just very lightly because we'll come back and add a neck hole there. All right, so that was A and B, giving us our body panels. So it could be front and back. They're essentially symmetrical at this point until we add the neck hole. Next is point of shoulder to wrist. So I'm going to center that off of where the neckline is. And count out 2, 4, 6.75 and 2, 4, 6.75. Right, and then D, which was the base of the sleeve, is that largest bicep measure. In this case, it's becoming 4.75. So this is where I'm going to count from the shoulder seam .25 in either direction. And then I'll have just a tad more. It's a little hard to see on this paper, again, because I'm scaling it down for you. I'll transfer those marks to the other side. All right, so we have length, we have the bicep, and again, this is the front and the back, so it goes all the way around the arm. That's why we didn't divide this one by 2. And then that largest hand measurement, which in this case is going to be 2.75 total. So I'm going to take it just a little further. I've got my 2, and I'm just going a little further than that measurement. Then I can just connect the dots. Again, this will be much simpler on trugrid if you're going inch for inch, but I wanted to ensure the entire garment fit on this regular size sheet of paper. Drawing it for you here. Okay, so you can see the angle is a little steeper than I have on the sleeve here, and that's because this is going with a larger bicep. So that immediately kind of gets built into the framework of the pattern. Okay, the next piece is for our gussets. And I am going to come out about an inch. So that's just marking a quarter on here. And then I will start that gusset. So that was 13.25. Now, since it would be difficult to count these on a diagonal, they wouldn't be even if I counted them on a diagonal. I'm going to count here on the straight, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13, and I said 13.25. So I'm going to count that way, measure that, and then use my ruler to make the mark. So if I start at the 0 on the ruler, that comes to 1 tick past 3 1/4. I think that one actually did not get adjusted for this garment length, because I went with preferred garment length instead. So this one I'm going to actually adjust when I go to my trugrid pattern, because here, instead of using her height, I actually used her preferred garment length because she wanted this to fall just above the ankle. So I'm going to have to adjust this side gore as well. But what we often do is you take this same length that you have here, and one of the tricks when you're patterning, and I usually do this if I'm on the garment itself, is to take something that matches this measure, and then you use it like a compass. You can use your measuring tape if you're doing this on your cutting table to swing your curve out. And what that does is it pulls up the hem. If you've ever hemmed a garment that you've made geometrically with a straight triangle, you'll notice that these side hems are hanging way down and you have to cut more off on the side. This compensates for that because it's still going to be the same distance from your armpit to the floor straight as your armpit to the floor on your side seam. You might adjust this if somebody has particularly large hips and they maybe need a little bit more projection there, but it's not going to be by much. It might be a couple of inches. So that's just one trick for getting that angle as you're drawing your pattern out. Okay, so you get the gist there. Then I'm just going to add in the underarm gusset line. That's what it looks like when it's sewn in place. What I would do is sew 2 edges here and the other 2 edges get connected over here. But these are actually representing the same piece. And in this case, my underarm gusset, I might draw it just to remind myself to cut it. And I'm only having to cut 2 of those. and that was a 4-inch square, so it's just going to be 1 inch on this graph paper. Okay, so I want to address the neck hole since that's not necessarily described in the pattern. What I typically do is, and this is open to you know, whatever your needs are as far as designing your neck hole. What I typically do is do at least a 1-inch drop in the back. So right now this was at the quarter mark. That's actually going to be 1 inch if I just take another quarter of this square. So I'm coming onto my main line here, just because my center line was offset a little bit. So I'm going to start at that 1 inch mark, and then I typically will do a 3-inch drop. So from center, I'm going to come the rest of that quarter down to the bottom of this square. So that now is 3 inches. So I would do a 3-inch drop in the front, a 1-inch drop in the back. On extant garments, we actually see that sometimes this doesn't have a curve at all. It's straight across. But I know I personally have some neck issues, and having something straight across actually presses on my neck and is really uncomfortable. So I always do at least a 1-inch drop. You might need to adjust this based on the neck and head position for the individual you're making it for, but this is sort of a standard 1 inch on the back, 3 inches on the front, because we want this to be a relatively close-fitting jewel neck. Okay, and then I also would go 3 inches to either side. So I'm just putting all these spacers in here, and then we'll draw a nice curve for that neckline. Bring a little height on that side. Okay, and then we will open the front for a front slit, and I would take that, let's see, probably 4 to 6 inches for that front slit. I would do a little reinforcing stitching right here, but then on this we're going to add a band collar. So if you also want to make sure, you're not forgetting any pattern pieces, we'll go ahead and draw in a couple of the bonus pieces here. So I might also choose to draw my band collar. For the purposes of this, I would usually make it stand approximately 1 inch tall or a little less. So if you wanted a band collar to be 1 inch tall, then you're going to cut it for 2 inches, but then you want to allow seam allowance. So probably do 3 inches. And then what I would normally do is measure around this neckline. If I was adding the band collar, which you don't have to do on a Gomlek. On a Gomlek, you could just roll this edge. But a band collar is nice because it protects your caftan if you're wearing those as your outer layer. And it's protecting that and keeping that clean, especially if you're marching multiple days with the band. You would like to have a fresh Gomlek for each day, and that band collar is going to keep this nice clean surface and keep your caftan more clean, keeping all the sweat away from it. So what I typically would do is once I had this done, I would measure that. So just as an estimate, I'm going to say 8, 16, yeah, I have a neck measurement here. So neck is generally, her neck is at 14.75, so I'm going to say about 16 inches. And then just draw in my neckband piece, and this might just be, again, having those underarm gussets and the neckband. I'm cutting those out last, so I'm usually cutting them from scrap, but I'm just putting them there so that, you know, if you feel that's needed so that you don't forget those pieces, you can do that. Another option is to actually have a shoulder seam here. So I did draw this line really lightly before, but if I was adding a shoulder seam, I do want to make sure I've added seam allowance on both sides, and then have that shoulder seam. That shoulder seam is good, especially if you have somebody with sloping shoulders, because then you could adjust that shoulder seam to have it create the slope that they might have on their shoulder before you attach the sleeve. So that can be a nice trick, tailoring trick for you as well. And I think that is all of our pieces. So just to help you understand this, we'd be cutting 4. You might want to annotate your pattern. That can be really helpful. That we're going to have 1 of the front, 1 of the back. We're going to cut 2 sleeves, so I don't actually have to create that pattern piece twice. I can just create it and say cut 2. I'm going to cut 4 of my gores. I'm going to cut these 2 underarm gussets and 1 of this neck binding band. Another trick with the neck binding band is you also can cut that on the bias, and that will make it go around the curve a little more easily and lay nicely. But if you're working with linen or cotton, I generally find you can get it on there and then just kind of steam it into submission. So this is your basic Gomlek pattern, and we'll do the next one in the next video. Thank you and happy sewing!